In this video, we will learn about CSS selectors. Selectors allow us to accurately target elements and ranges of elements with our CSS rules. Throughout the course of this video, we will be modifying the page in front of us so that the words and styling of the text match up. For instance, we're going to make this bit of text red and this bit of text blue and boldface. In order to do this, we're going to need to call upon general, ID, class, descendant, and pseudo selectors. Before we jump into any CSS, let's take a look at the page that we're going to be styling. In addition to this header element, the page is primarily composed of paragraph and anchor elements. Some of these elements are in an unordered list. These elements are all going to be styled blue, and most of the paragraph and anchor elements outside of the unordered list should be styled red. Let's make this our first goal. Generally, with CSS rules, you want to work in broad general cases and then style for specific rules as they come. So let's begin by making the claim that all paragraph and anchor elements are red. To make this claim just for paragraph elements, it would look like this. Now, of course, we could write a separate rule for anchor elements that looks the same, but this is a little less human readable, and if we'd like to modify the rule, we're going to have to make our changes twice in the future. Fortunately, if we simply separate our P and A with a comma, the rule will apply to both paragraph and anchor elements. When reading a CSS rule literally, commas translate to and. So our rule reads, paragraph and anchor elements have red text. Let's take a look at the page. So this rule isn't perfect. Most notably, this unordered list, which is supposed to contain only blue elements, is full of red text. On the other hand, there's one really great thing about the rule we've just written, and that's that it's given us some elements which are completely styled and that we never have to touch again with our CSS. That's this plain red text that is the color it's supposed to be. Our next goal now is to isolate these elements in the unordered lists with a CSS rule so we can turn them blue, overriding the red text. It's time for a little terminology. We'd like our next CSS rule to target only elements within unordered lists. These elements are descendants of the unordered list element because they can be found between the unordered list's elements' opening and closing tags. Conversely, the unordered list element is an ancestor of all elements found between its tags. If there's only one layer of differentiation, this becomes a parent-child relationship as well as an ancestor-descendant relationship. For example, this li element is the parent of this paragraph element. The paragraph element, conversely, is the child of the li element. With this understanding of the ancestor relationship, we should be able to write a descendant selection rule, which will apply to all paragraph elements within unordered lists. Descendant selection rules take a string of elements as their input. The first element should be the ancestor of all elements that follow it. So this descendant selection rule that I've just written applies to all paragraph elements who have an unordered list as their ancestor. And of course, we're going to color these elements blue. I'd like to quickly show you a couple other ways this rule or very similar rules could be written. Let's say our unordered list contained more than just paragraph elements. Rather than writing new rules for all of these elements or creating a lengthy comma-separated list here, we could replace the P with the star operator. And the star operator literally translates to everything. So this new rule would apply to everything that has an unordered list as an ancestor. For our purposes here, this rule is probably too broad and would apply to the list item elements as well, which we don't explicitly want. We can also make our original blue rule less general by changing the ancestor-descendant relationship to a parent-child relationship. This greater sign describes the parent-child relationship. It causes our rule to read all paragraph elements, which are the children of list items. This is probably as good as our blue rule is going to get. It's a very specific rule, and it also styles all of the items that we'd like to be blue, blue. So let's leave it like this and take a look at our page again. This looks pretty good. Because our descendant selection rule is more specific than the general red text rule, within the unordered list where our descendant selection rule applies, the red text has been overwritten by our blue rule. At the end of this video, we'll discuss in detail how CSS decides which rules are more specific than others. But for now, and in most cases, you can operate under the assumption that descendant selection rules are more specific than general CSS rules. And class selection, which we're about to explore, is more specific than descendant selection. Many different types of elements on our page desire bold and italic text. Rather than trying to navigate general CSS rules, which will select this paragraph element and not this paragraph element, what we're going to do is write a CSS class rule, which we can then manually apply to HTML elements. To declare a CSS class, you begin with a period, and then you can name the class pretty much whatever you'd like. I'm going to name this one bold. From this point forward, it operates just like a normal CSS rule. In CSS, to make bold text, we need to change our font weight to bold. Now we can manually apply this class to HTML elements. Here's a paragraph here that should be bold. We insert classes between the less than and greater than signs, which encompass the opening tag of an element. Here we simply give it a class attribute and make the value of that class attribute the CSS rule we'd like to apply. Now I'm going to use copy and paste to quickly style our couple other bold elements bold. Now we're going to do the same thing with italics. Declare class, and our command for italic font is to change font style to italic. Now our header element gets the italic class. What about this element right here, which desires to be both bold and italic? Well, an element can have more than one CSS rule. All we need to do is separate the strings, which declare our classes, with spaces. Swinging back to our page quickly, everything seems to be in order. We've made italic and bold text without modifying any of the other styling on the page, which we were really happy with. 90% of this page is great and finished. The only thing we have left to do is style this text at the bottom, which claims to be green, usually. My plan here is to make this text green, except when we mouse over it, and on those instances, I'd like the text to turn purple. This last element we're going to style is unique. None of the attributes we're going to give it are shared by any other elements on the page. So this is a great opportunity to use the ID selector. ID selectors are a lot like class selectors, but they do have three differences. First, each ID selector should only pair to a single element. Second, each element can have at most one ID selector. And third, ID selectors are more specific than class selectors. So, if their attributes come in conflict with those in a class selector or a descendant selector or a general selector, the ID selector will win out. Let's name our ID selector Special. And to start with, let's just have it declare green text. That's 50% of our styling goals for this element. The other thing we want to do is cause this element to turn purple when it's moused over. In order to make this happen, we're going to use a pseudo selector. Pseudo selectors actually modify existing selectors. So in this case, we're going to start with our special selector. You can also put pseudo selectors after general selectors or descendant selectors or anything else, really. What pseudo selectors do is they allow us to tap into the state of an element when certain conditions have occurred. The conditions we can access depend on the nature of the element. But just about every element has this hover condition, which means that the person viewing our web page has put their mouse over top of the element. When that occurs, we would like our special ID element to turn purple. Once we put the special ID tag on that unique element at the bottom of our page, both the special ID selector and the pseudo special ID selector, when applicable, should apply to it. Just like adding a class to an element, we add an ID to an element by using the ID attribute and then putting the ID name between quotation marks. Let's save our page and take a look at its final styling. Okay, the text is green. That's a great sign. And here comes the mouse over. Purple. As promised, we'll finish this video by exploring how CSS determines when one rule is more specific than another. If you remember, CSS gives priority to rules deemed more specific than other rules. I should also mention that if two rules are deemed equally specific, the rule declared later will get priority. For the purpose of the algorithm we're about to employ, comma-separated elements count as only one element. What we're going to do is assign a 3-digit number to each of our CSS rules. In the ones place, we're going to put the number of HTML elements referenced in the rule's declaration. In this case, that value is 1, because p comma a, for the purpose of this algorithm, only counts as one element. For our descendant selection rule, we're going to put 2, because there's both a list item and a paragraph element referenced. In the tens column of our number, we're going to put the number of class selectors and pseudo selectors used in the rules declaration. For our bold and italic rules, this value is 1, and we give the 3-digit number the value 10. Lastly, as you've probably guessed, in the hundreds place goes the number of ID selectors in the rule. For our special ID selector, the value will end up being 100. The special hover rule has one ID selector and one pseudo selector referenced, making its value a 110. Since this is the largest value, this is the most specific rule and will gain priority over all the other rules. I hope you learned something from this exploration of CSS selectors. See you next time.